All right. Hello, everyone. Welcome to episode 21 of the AwesomeAlgo podcast. I am more than grateful to welcome here a new guest and hopefully not just guest going forward, Mike. He is a lead engineer at Algorand Foundation. Mike has been absolutely instrumental in the protocol called LiquidAuth. And obviously, there's a lot more contributions that he did over the years into the Algorand ecosystem in general. I'm really excited to welcome you here. And I think what would be a good topic to cover over the course of this episode is basically just break it down into some of the layman terms to explain what LiquidAuth is generally is and why is it important, why is it a lot better than big centralized solutions like WalletConnect, but most importantly, why it's also important from the perspective of Algorand adoption and interoperability with more conventional Web2 ecosystems given the announcement at Cypher. And for listeners out there, I would really recommend going to the Algorand Foundation's channel and seeing all of the amazing keynotes that were presented at Barcelona, including some of the demos that were demonstrating the work that Mike has been directly working on as well. And yeah, with that, I would really love to welcome you here, Mike. Before I will jump into further steps, just a few more additional announcements at the end of the episode. As it usually goes with the AwesomeAlgo episodes, we'll cover a few questions from the community. Some folks were asking a few technical questions on the protocol on Twitter, and we would also cover a little bit about what's happening with the AwesomeAlgo repo. Some of you folks may have noticed the announcements that were happening recently, and essentially there's a set of repositories that were maintained by myself under the AwesomeAlgo sort of ecosystem logo, and a set of really useful utilities that Mike has been working on. And what we did after discussing it is essentially, let's go ahead and consolidate them all under one open source organization that could serve multiple purposes, including the purpose of being a test bed for anything for which neither of us have enough commitment during our full-time commitments within the work happening in AlgoKit, and in case of Mike, the work happening at the core Algorand Foundation commitments there. And with that, I'd like to announce a 21 on LiquidAuth with Mike Feher. And I guess would be awesome to start with a little bit of introduction and biography. It's up to you, obviously, on how deep you want to go there. But if you could perhaps start a little bit about yourself, your background, and how did you get into this crazy and exciting industry?
For sure. It's been a wild ride, and I really can't back up some of the sentiment that you had mentioned about the work being done between Foundation and MakerX and even over at the Inc. It's just been absolute inspiration. And so this podcast is kind of my print line hello world to the community. And for me, I have tried to stay away from my background a lot of times, mainly because I don't want to detract from people getting into the industry and things like that. But I come from a really down to earth family, working class backgrounds. And when I was young, one of the first books I ran into, the DOS operator's manual, five. And this was right when I was probably around 5 or 6, just really little. I could barely remember most of the things I read back then, but I certainly remember that DOS operating manual. And that's really was my introduction to computers. And at the time, that's what a computer was. It was a blinking cursor on a screen, and the manual said, this is how you automate. Here's batch files. Okay, if you hit the limits of batch files, here's the basic programming language. And to me, that was just the end of the world and just infinite excitement. And I just could not keep myself away from that. And as time went on, we started to see things like the Windows operating system. And I just couldn't be more excited. And that kind of joy has stuck with me all the way to today. I mean, even every little protocol change, it's like I'm jumping for joy because this stuff is exciting. It's like technology is ever evolving. It never stops. And that's really what got me into the field. And so that DOS book really turned me open to this concept of programmability and what a computer really does. And during the time, the internet was very small back then. There was only a handful of services, and we used a service called ProdigyNet. And on ProdigyNet, there was these online forums and IRCs that had a lot of interesting groups in them. And that's kind of where I spent a lot of my childhood, was hanging out in these online communities that specialized in really interesting problems. And one of those problems, probably around the time I was probably around 9 or 10, this group was working on the DES challenge, which at the time, the RSA group was put out an offer to see if anyone could crack DES encryption. And within, I think it was a week, not our group, but another group was able to successfully break the challenge. And a few years go by, and we start to see ASICs come on the scene. And this group introduced me to everything I know about programming today. And so this would be Perl. We were into, back then, phreaking was big. That's actually where Feher 0 comes from, is crafting different integrated circuits in order to do interesting things with telephone equipment. And when I was young, it was a completely different ecosystem than it is now. I mean, the heroes back then were John Draper, RMS, Torvalds, and the mentality was RTFM. So it was a hostile environment for a young person, and I never really appreciated that side of it. And I kind of fell into this mindset of technology as a tool that should be used. And with that mindset, a lot of people around me kind of realized, okay, this kid's young, we don't know what to do with him. And they decided that maybe university path would be appropriate. And so around 14 is when I started to take computer science, computer information courses. And I ran into a situation there where the professors were kind of saying, you need to get out of this academia, you need to get directly into the field and go to work. It is one of those situations where C# had just came out. It was the new language. They were teaching C+ at universities. It was a weird situation where technology was literally moving faster than textbooks could be printed. And we didn't have, everything on the internet was clear text.
I
It
don't think
was,
this trend ever stopped, actually.
yeah,
This still goes on. I think it's even more behind these days.
absolutely. And so these problems are still the same fundamental problems we work on today. I mean, blockchains try to solve data existing in two places. Scalability, back when I was in university, was the C10K problem, was sharding, being able to handle 10,000 concurrent connections. These were the problems that were fun, they were interesting, they were difficult, but they were worth solving. And it's why we are where we are today. And it took me 36 years to finally realize that my story was unique. And I looked for answers, and I found one with a ASD diagnosis. So that explains a lot about my young childhood. And I really think that in our industry, it really doesn't matter about how you start or when you start. It's that you're passionate and you enjoy it. If you find anything like that in your life, then hold on to it. It's, you don't need to necessarily make a career out of it as long as it's fulfilling to you. And I think that's been my ethos of how I got to where I am now. It is why I'm in blockchain. It's an interesting problem. It's solving a lot of computer science problems. And then there's a whole ethical dilemma around blockchains and decentralizations. And I think that really opens the door to a lot of the inspiration behind LiquidAuth, is really kind of this ethos of, we should be in control of our pipelines. We should be in control of our keys. If I have something on my own phone and I'm on a website, I should be able to get to that without a mediator, without anybody in between. And so this is the ethos of really my whole career path. Decentralization, offline first, or what we call local first now. These concepts are incredibly important to me. data sovereignty or self-sovereignty. Like these should be fundamental rights of the internet, just like how the internet should be open and free. That's how I view things like LiquidAuth, where anyone should be able to take primitives, use them on their own without anybody's permission, basically.
First of all, Mike, thank you for the amazing intro. I think it shouldn't have taken 30 years to figure out that you indeed had an amazing career and an entry into this industry. And I agree more with some of your remarks in regards to sometimes because like computer science and the applied software engineering is really different. But like when you start from the early age and when you only have experience in academia on the early years, it's always easy to associate them together, right? Oh, I'm going to learn all of the fancy data structure that optimizes space complexity or whatever, and just to never ever return to this back in your life. And then you realize that there's a lot more aspects and a lot more importance on just interacting with other humans, working in a team, and just being a great collaborator. That's also very important to learn in this regard. So I can't agree more with. And I think this is such a great discouragement. I think of all the amazing minds out there who just probably met the wrong teacher sometime in their early university years, who maybe gave something discouraging, or like people who, for example, struggle with trying to focus on particular topics with different things like ADHD. Like all of this is mostly side effects of the information overload, I feel like, that we live in. But it's extremely
Absolutely.
important to have someone in your life who, in your early career or early years, especially in software engineering, basically knows how to set the stage for you so that you know what to expect from this industry, because it's a lot more than just sitting 24 hours a day staring at the screen and typing letters on the keyboard. I wish it
Definitely.
was like that, but unfortunately it's not.
And pushing through a lot of those boundaries where it took all the way up to seeing people like John out there talking about post-quantum security for me to care about cryptography again. Because when I was young, I was hanging around crackers who said, we're going to create an ASIC in 5 years anyway, this, that, the other. And so they really were just basically all security is snake oil. And it put me off from a lot of that academic work that I is one of my weaknesses, is where I rely heavily on our team for cryptographic primitives. And I'm now starting a new journey, relearning the past 10 years or so, 15 years of cryptography. And it's been fun. You gotta always never be afraid to tackle something that you're uncomfortable with.
Awesome. But yeah, continuing with, I guess, the topic of the LiquidAuth, I do feel like it's, while maybe a bird's eye view into what it is, rather simple to grasp, there's a lot of building blocks there. But the good thing is that those building blocks are not coming from the sort of the Web3 industry in this case. This is a very solid attempt, basically, from the entire engineering team at Algorand Foundation to look at what's currently available in the industry, what are the big sort of protocols, for example, published by the W3C consortium in this case. What does the actual big enterprises, banks, governments would potentially lean to? And I highly doubt it's something that they would start diving into, like Web3 protocols in this case. But those specific things, there's a lot of terms in there, and I wonder if we could maybe just set the stage for the terminology a little bit. So if we were to start with some of the terms in this case, for example, so obviously the main bits is the WebAuthn protocol. In this case, we would also potentially would need to cover probably things like FIDO, right? And the distinction between different ways of defining it, right? Because it's both a consortium, but then you also have a set of primitives and protocols that they provide. And then lastly, probably some additional abstractions that build on top of things like WebAuthn, like passkeys. And I know there's also work being done on the Algorand side behind some of the decentralized identity protocols, the verifiable credentials, or the DID. So if we were to just briefly, I guess, set the mental model, obviously it's an audio format podcast, right? So we can't really show you UML diagrams or go over the specs that they provide. But if we were to provide something in a fairly digestible format, how would you set the stage for those abstractions?
Absolutely. Luckily, there's one commonality between a lot of them, at least outside of DID, which FIDO2, WebAuthn, and what we call passkeys commonly are really public key credentials. And you can find the documentation for public key credentials on every platform, from the browser to Android to anything that supports FIDO2 or WebAuthn. And you can think of WebAuthn kind of like the TypeScript of JavaScript. They're the same specification, more or less. Just one happens to be a little bit further along and is the one we commonly call passkeys, is really a WebAuthn spec. But under the hood, they're all really just public key credentials from FIDO2 specification. And so what does all of this mean? What is a public key credential? And why are these things important? And so public key credentials are effort in order to kind of bring the same kind of key pairs that we use for our wallet addressing addresses and for payments, but on a industrial level, a standardized cross-platform exchange of credential information. And that's really what FIDO2 is. It defines what is a public key credential, how can it be used, and why should we use it? And after evaluation, we decided to go forward with a proof of concept of what can be done with these passkeys. And in the early initial phases, we really were talking with people from the community to see what kind of options that they pursued or what kind of options have been pursued in other ecosystems. And that's really where a lot of the energy came from and the inspiration, where we've had a long time of discussion around authentication in our ecosystem. And FIDO has been brought up several times in these discussions. And so this was our first effort at creating a example using these public key credentials as an authentication mechanism, which they are, as I said, just like your wallet keys, except for they're used in authentication. And I think that is the part where we start to see the blurring of the lines and why it gets a little bit confusing, where you see multiple key pairs being used for all these purposes. And the reason that this is confusing is because our ecosystem doesn't have an HD wallet widely adopted across the board. And so a lot of these things are new, but they're very old in traditional systems. So it's like having a centralized certificate or key, a master key that derives child keys, is something that's very common in Web2 ecosystems. And it's even common in Web3 ecosystems with things like BIP39, BIP32. And so a lot of the starting of this whole journey was from that perspective of HD wallets and what can we do with our keys? Like, we have a wallet with keys that are primitives that we can use for so many different purposes, but all we do is we use them for signing things on chain. And I think that's great. I think that's the minimum they need to do. But at the same time, it's like there's a whole world out there of things like public key credentials and other ways of using these keys that have been around for a long time. And we're only seeing now these types of solutions come out. And I think it is mainly because of the WebAuthn standard and them starting to open the doors a bit to people like ourselves, where prior to this, even back in this past September in 2023, you could not do what we were doing today. Then it is such a new bringing down of the walled garden that I believe there's only 10 other apps on the Play Store right now that even have some of these features integrated. And that's really kind of what LiquidAuth is trying to do. Is it's a canary almost of development, where we are finding these primitives and we're going through the integration pain to figure out what the solution looks like at the end. And by doing that, we come up with something like LiquidAuth, and where this is just a standard auth system that accepts a public key credential and allows you to be authenticated. And so for us, this is a step towards things like you would see at the Decipher presentation. Well, now I have a wallet. It has my payment keys. I might have some encryption keys on there that I use for securing data. Then I have my identity keys, which I use to create public key credential pairs. And this really is amazing. It is like you would have one mnemonic that you could back up that has all your cryptographic information on it, that you could rederive all your cryptographic information from that one seed phrase. And then you never have to worry about Google Password Manager. If you're able to back up your seed phrase properly, you can recover all your passkeys, all your encryption keys, maybe your SSH keys at some point, just speculating. But it is one of those situations where we started to look at, with the work that Bruno and John have been doing, with just what are the standards that are out there and how can we use them. And I ran into some really great implementations. Loot Wallet was exploring using a public key credential in order to derive entropy instead of using a mnemonic. That's something that's possible within the FIDO2 protocol. You might have seen Akita and Kirby's work with abstracted accounts and using a passkey as a form of attestation for an abstracted account, where now your passkey is actually the key to your automated account. And these are the types of things that got us excited. That's really where it came from. And our implementation is what we would call a state-of-the-art, by the books FIDO implementation. So that's the heart of what we wanted to build. And we added on top of that things that are more specific to our ecosystem. And it's mainly due to that part of the walled garden, where that walled garden has come down quite a lot over the years, but it's still not at a point where we can just use our keys on every phone, on any device. Right now, only Android 14 and iOS 17 and above have these rich features. It is very much bleeding edge. So what we did with LiquidAuth was we found clever ways to get around this, which luckily the FIDO2 specification has the ability to extend these public keys. And that's what we've done, is we've added an extension to passkeys that allow you to take another key pair outside of the scope of FIDO and use it as an additional attestation along with your passkey. So you say, here's my passkey, and here is proof that I own a wallet. And that allows you access to the service. When we start to see the future as we move forward, and Android 14 is no longer supported on 4% of devices or wherever it is now, these keys will actually come from your mnemonic. You will be able to derive these key pairs directly from a single mnemonic using the work that's being done by the crypto team at the foundation. And that will allow you to do things like sign in with GitHub and things like that. And these things will become ubiquitous. Whether we adopt or not, this is clearly the path that the industry is going down. Every single site supports passkeys now. And this is our primitives, where we say, here are all the things you need to work with passkeys. And here is a solution example that allows you to do them in the traditional method, which is authentication to a stateful service.
And for the listeners out there, a lot of the things that Mike was also highlighting was presented during Decipher, and specifically the bits where there was also a demo of authenticating to GitHub, for example, using the LiquidAuth protocol in this case. But to have a quick recap of this particular section, everyone is familiar with the existing experience of authentication within the realms of things like WalletConnect, for example. I'm pretty sure, especially if you're a developer out there and started a while back during the early days of Algorand, you probably had a lot of, I actually still remember the cases of the first WalletConnect integration and basically helping as a volunteer to beta test some of the features. And I do remember the amount of times I had to reset my cache, do some obscure settings in the browser. And a lot of that is also attributed to the fact that, as Mike is outlining, it's important to distinguish the reason why there's so much push for the LiquidAuth from the Algorand Foundation side is when you rely on something like WalletConnect, you're not relying on open standards or open building blocks in this case. First of all, it's a VC-backed company that basically provides a centralized service. A middleman that always is required to be there in order for you to perform the authentication. Obviously, they did some improvements in the Web 2, but just the fundamental principles behind WalletConnect and some of the ties it may have to some of the bigger ecosystems out there isn't fundamentally something that is easily set for interoperability. And obviously, when you talk about big centralized entities providing authentication mechanisms, there's a lot of ways where you could claim that things can go wrong in this case. And just by looking at the user experience that you're getting with systems like this, I think it's a fairly clear indicator of something needs to change. And the protocols that Michael was describing, and in this case, I guess also important to maybe add a little distinction on FIDO2, right? And if I understand it correctly, and the reason why there's so much confidence behind why these things are going to be adopted by the industry is, well, one of the things you can do is, for example, looking at the people proposing the changes and on the committee, FIDO, right? It's pretty much most of the thing is on that list, and you could see a lot of that presence. Like passkeys has been announced pretty much on all like what iOS devices. Google has been doing a lot of this work as well, Microsoft as well. So it's obviously, and those big entities, they do work a lot with enterprises, they work with governments, they have tons of business partnerships in that particular area. So it makes sense that if they are all on board with that particular interoperability initiative, we will start seeing more and more enterprises adopting it. So it absolutely is crucial that if you want to abstract away blockchain as a tool and just essentially present it as something that you consider when solving any engineering problem, not something that you have to approach as, oh, it's a whole ideology, it's a whole ecosystem, right? I have to dive into it. It's just a tool. We're using open standards, we're using open protocols in this case. And that's, in my understanding, is pretty much the motivations behind. But what else gives you confidence basically about FIDO2 stuff, right? Well, why do you think that? Because if you look at the things that big enterprises are doing in regards to Web3, and rightfully so, right? There's a lot of legal frameworks that needs to be built, and it just makes sense that if it's a massive big business, they would have to do extra due diligence to ensure that if there is a new Web3 specific app that is going onto their application store, goes under a rigorous review, right? You wouldn't want to publish an app that gives you an access to interact with a contract that can steal your money, for example, or something like that. So it makes sense that they has been, and we actually experienced that as well quite recently with some of the features that's been announced at Decipher in regards to simplifying AlgoKit installation. So what gives you confidence that it won't be a matter of them pushing for FIDO3, something like that would somehow make it actually harder for decentralized systems within blockchain space to build on them?
I completely agree, where it is one of those situations that we even saw within the FIDO2 specification with WebAuthn come out as a competing, but aligned with standard. It is one of the fundamentals when we get into any kind of standardization effort that there's going to be a lot of churn rate around the edges. And you look for the thing in the middle that is the foundational pieces or the glue. And the thing that I've noticed with FIDO2 in particular is both the CTAP and the public key credentials are two parts that are so ingrained, and CTAP being more of a systems protocol for hardware, those things are a lot harder to change. They require manufacturers to change practices, and it's a much more difficult problem than my API in the browser has changed. It is such a concrete system that we won't really see that move. And that's been verified by over time, all the way up to passkeys. There are still public key credentials that really haven't changed in their shape, but a lot of the things around them have changed. The way that you can request them from systems has changed. So there will be these things that we can look for. In the case of FIDO2, it's the public key credential. that we can kind of say, we feel good about this feature or this interface can be trusted, it can be relied on. And the reason it can be trusted is because all of the industry is looking at the same object and trying to put it in different contexts, deriving it in different places, in different scenarios, maybe from your wallet, maybe from your browser, maybe from TPMs or security keys. All of those things are being handled around that object, and the only thing that you have to worry about is how to integrate, where it's like when you're integrating, you're getting the public key credential get options and you're passing it to the authenticator. The authenticator is getting the public key credential and giving you a public key credential response. And those things are everywhere. Every single SDK native interface that I've run into so far has used those. So although it may change the way that you get your public key credential and it may change how you use it, fundamentally, these things are pretty much set in stone at this point. And the industry coalescing around it really only removes any fragility that would be there, because now it's in our browsers, it's in our operating systems. Those are very difficult things to roll back, especially when your competition is doing it. So it's, you got Apple, Google, Microsoft, all three in the space. And I don't see them going away anytime. And we kind of piggyback off of that rich ecosystem to get all the security guarantees. FIDO has audit processes, certifications of equipment, just so many well thought out parts of the specification that we don't really have to worry about all these edge cases. We don't have to sit there and say, well, what if this is compromised? What if the session has been hijacked? The only way you can prove that the device you have is the device you say it is if you can extract that key pair and sign something with it. And that is where I see a lot of the security guarantee, where like the protocol itself, as long as you abide by it and don't step outside of its bounds, gives you this rich platform to build on. It may not be the easiest thing to integrate, and I think that's just partially due to the age. I think FIDO is a much more mature specification. WebAuthn and passkeys are the newer iteration, and clearly it's not going away. So we're stuck with the integration pains, and these primitives, the public key credential, is really the star of the whole system. It is where all the industries have coalesced around, and that is what we'll probably see the most of into the future. And this is not the same thing as something like a verifiable credential, which is an even newer decentralized DID based system that's very similar to public key credentials. So we have yet another competing standard for a very similar model. But I do believe that this is where we're going to see the most churn, where I feel strongly that FIDO is going to remain stable, but things like DID or any of these very similar related specifications, they're going to have a much higher churn rate. And I've even seen people experiment with adding their public key credentials as a part of an attestation statement of DID document. And there's a lot of stuff there, but really, like our focus really has been on primitives, because as it is now, I believe it's ARC27 is one of our first message passing primitives and things of that nature. So having the ability to get key material or derive keys with HD wallets is really a prerequisite to a lot of this stuff. And so we went forward with a canary to show what's possible and where we're going. And we do want people to hop in and adopt. We think that this is where most systems will be in the future, where we're going to live in a passwordless world. The main log item for us is getting passkeys, creating passkeys, deriving new key pairs. These types of problems are going to become more and more common the more and more we see more primitives like the public key credential being out in the ecosystem. It's like we're used to it with signing transaction messages. Well, now our browsers are starting to integrate into this world where there's not much difference between a public key credential and the key pairs we use for regular signing. It is.
And this is just, I guess, mostly for the listeners out there who may not be familiar with this term. Any chance you could just add a few sentences on the term for the HD wallets?
Absolutely. So HD wallets is a practice that's used very commonly to take a mnemonic where you enter your seed phrase, and then instead of having to keep generating new seed phrases for every account you want, you can use that same seed phrase in a clever way in order to create a new key pair based off that original one. And you can also find information that can link the two together. And this is something the cryptography team will have much more information on than mine, but this is the very high level, is that it's a way to take one seed phrase and turn it into many keys. And that allows us to really have a more robust system for things like backing up,
Yeah,
recovery,
exactly.
and then even like linking things together. So like anonymity is normally something that is a positive, but sometimes it can be a negative. So it's, if we have identity keys and we're able to associate them to a payment key, things like that. And the crypto guys have way more information on that, but that's the gist. Is it's like we can already do this. So it like you could take your seed phrase and come up with your own HD wallet strategy. I believe Ledger has done the same thing. So there's nothing stopping us from doing it. This is just a concrete implementation that says, here's an interface. It does exactly what it's supposed to do. And that's really what LiquidAuth is. It's, here is a FIDO interface. It does exactly what FIDO expects it to do. And we want to build off of these primitives in order to create an ecosystem where there isn't a WalletConnect anymore. And we don't have to worry about these things. And we have our own message passing arcs and things along those lines. I mean, it's very common in the other ecosystems. They have a lot of these. They've kind of been around a lot longer, working on these fundamental problems. And we kind of hopped on to the existing everything. So you'll see some of our arcs are focused on WalletConnect and stuff like that. So it's really just flushing out the missing pieces, using LiquidAuth as the canary to say, here's where we're going. It has arbitrary signing. It has a FIDO extension, which could become its own ARC for authentication, has a signaling mechanism to allow peer-to-peer connections. We are currently working on a 27 Kotlin-based provider for messages. And so all these primitives are things that haven't existed prior to the engineering team's efforts and the ARC efforts going on there. So it really is kind of like our first big launch of something that is what I would call a canary. And it's very much like an NFT situation where sometimes you have to move into the future before you can find the standards that you need to codify. And that's where we're at right now. And so we really want anyone out there who has any background in identity management or FIDO, WebAuthn to dive in, see what you can find, new ways to use passkeys, and we're going to continue to deliver the primitives. And if people find them useful, we're going to just keep pushing in this same direction. So I really hope people take it as an opportunity to kind of really digest what public key credentials are, how they can be used, and what we can do in the future with them. Because as it is right now, it's very much bleeding edge. And there is a lot of discovery that don't even think there was documentation for some of these interfaces while we were working on them. So all the help would be greatly appreciated for the community.
And so when I guess there's no need to like dive too deep into the architecture, but I'm just curious if you maybe just give a little bit of backstory, because I'm sure there might be one or two or maybe more, considering the fact you mentioning that as part of the work there were certain missing bits and pieces in the documentation as well. Prior to the initial efforts of integrating or implementing LiquidAuth in general, what would you say were the main implementation challenges in this regard? Because you have, okay, so like you have this set of widely adopted standards and protocols in the Web2 space. You have hundreds of companies in the Web3 space, all living in their own tiny little bubbles. Some bubbles are bigger because some people are collaborating, some companies are collaborating, like the Direct Alliance, for example, right? But then you still have a little bit of sort of sightedness maybe in some ecosystems, simply because of the nature of Web3 in this particular space. And now you have Algorand, highly scalable, very cheap transactions, very performant system. But how do we make it work? How do we make it work with standards that aren't necessarily generalized specifically to blockchain? So I'm just curious on what were the initial hurdles and the sort of thought process there.
Absolutely. You hit the vision statement of LiquidAuth on the head, where it's what can we do with these primitives in the context of blockchains? And let me tell you, if there's anyone out there that has worked on FIDO, it is a nightmare fuel situation where you read the specification, everything sounds great, and then you go to use it and you realize nothing works. And so that is the story of FIDO. I believe passwordless.io said that FIDO2 and WebAuthn are the most important, greatest specifications to have ever exist with the worst execution of all time. And I couldn't agree more, where you basically are in a situation where you have to do whatever the platform that you're on expects you to do, or else nothing works. And so there's a lot of these extensions that would have been very useful to have access to, like the PRF I mentioned earlier that Loot Wallet had looked into, that is just really hard to find what combination of two things allows this to work. And so we kind of settled on always allowing the platforms to decide how to generate the passkeys. And if we have the ability to, which generally we don't, to manage the key pairs ourselves, we do that. And in the context of Android 14 and iOS 17, that's possible. We can handle our own passkeys, generate them, store them however we want. But in most cases, when you go to ask for a passkey, you're going to ask Google Password Manager, you're going to ask Windows Hello, you're going to ask iCloud key storage for them to do it on your behalf. And that's great because it's as it is now, they're already useful. With things like abstracted accounts, we're going to need to be able to pull passkeys out and use them, things like that. So the challenge really is integration, where the primitives are strong, but the integration is non-trivial. And some of the hardest things right now in the space are finding those combinations and finding new ways of things to do with the passkeys once you have them. And every time you run into any kind of challenge, it is a really good opportunity to think about it in maybe a different way, because there is a lot of solutions out there where you're seeing multi-party computation examples with passkeys. I believe the most common one is abstracted accounts right now. And then you have something like Liquid, where it's just a set of primitives, an authenticated service using Web2 principles that allows Web3 credentials to also be used. And all these things are the challenges that the specification has in general, where we're always going to be trying to figure out how to get these keys without going through heavy work. Like a great example of heavy work would be implementing your own ledger device where you have full control, because that is the easiest place to do these types of things. If we wanted to have a device that stored our keys and also logged into GitHub, the easiest place to do that right now is either Android 14 or custom hardware. And so that's really what we've discovered with this whole project, is those types of pain points. Why does it hurt? What's available? What's not available? And our way of working around that is by extending the protocol in order to include things like peer negotiation for WebRTC, standard authentication with private keys from a wallet, which we commonly are calling proof of knowledge of private key. And so those two things combined, you can prove that you own a wallet, you can prove that you own a device, and that is the main features that we are able to deliver And on top of that, you're going to start to see all these integration pains. Luckily, most of them have been reduced because of the efforts of LiquidAuth, but it's still going to be a challenge. It's going to be up to us as a community to really take public key credentials and adopt them, where LiquidAuth is the first one to say, we're doing it, we're going to use them. It's not going to be easy. It's a very heavy spec, but we think strongly that it's the right path, and we don't think it's going away anywhere anytime soon. So here's our first entry is LiquidAuth, and it is not going to be very smooth sailing with FIDO, mainly because of the reasons I outlined, where we're so new. These APIs went stable in October, and even now today, there are still experimental flags all over the APIs, and we're gonna have integration pain. But we believe it's worth it because, again, it's imagine a world where you just have one wallet with all your cryptographic material in it, and you can log into your GitHubs and you can use it for Gmail and all these things. And that stuff's cool. It breaks us out of our bubble. I mean, it's not zero knowledge in the sense of like plonks and all these really cool things, other primitives that we're working on. They're at least standard, and that's the beauty of it. Is it's like with an implementation like this, yes, it's painful, but at the same time, it's like, what do you get at the other side of the tunnel? And at the other side of the tunnel, you're logging into GitHub, which is something that a lot of people just couldn't even fathom. A lot of the times we have dedicated services as middlemen or clever strategies to integrate with other services, like using parts of the signature of the email to attest to the thing. It's just like all these things are great and fun, but at the same time, it's these types of challenges, the standardization efforts, they're not easy, but you get so much rich integration from it. Just like I mentioned with abstracted accounts, it's now we have primitives in Android for wallet integrators to just grab a passkey, send it to an abstracted account if they need to. And these features are not even developed. It's just the fact that we already have the ability to get the passkey, and that's the only requirement to be able to submit it to a contract. And that's how we've kind of looked at it: is find those pain points, discover what's possible. We feel like we did a really good job at exploration, and we have several people in the out in the community that are exploring the other paths, like the abstracted accounts. And we just focused on primitives, where it's here's the parts, here's how you extract keys, here's what happens when you use discoverable flags, and all those little specification intricacies was the real workload.
How old is the FIDO2 spec by itself? Because I guess a lot of that could also be attributed to just general adoption. Like if you're, I guess there's a reason why, for example, Android 14 is currently something you can try LiquidAuth on, but then probably with iOS it takes a lot longer to get something like that went through the App Store review, and then they also only added those FIDO2 specific abstractions probably in, as you outlined, iOS 17, right? So I assume the reason why it's specifically those versions is because you were probably piggybacking on some core abstractions within the core Android and core iOS SDKs that they started exposing as they started pushing for the adoption of this thing, right?
You got it, where it's like you can very easily generate these public key pairs, but that integration path around them is really where you get bound to the native API, where the browser is a perfect example. It's a sandbox environment. You can't really do anything outside of Navigator credential object, where they won't allow you to do anything that the platform doesn't want you to do. In Android, it's been that way. And with Android 14, they've decided to say, maybe we should allow somebody other than Google Password Manager to also act in the same kind of level that Google Password Manager works, where it is deeply integrated and allows you to hijack the transports around the public key. So that means when you see the intent pop up on the phone when you're signing into Android, you can decide what is displayed there rather than only Google Password Manager letting you do that. So Google Password Manager is allowing other people to build their own version of Google Password Manager. And that's the real difference. Is before we did not have access to the secure element, we would ask it to provide us a key and it would do everything through native APIs. In the new version on Android 14, it's very much similar, but the difference is they allow you to generate the keys as a step.
Yeah.
Yeah, and that's one of the things.
But that would still imply that, let's assume near distant future, several LiquidAuth providers implemented that. I guess the part where big enterprises still have a little bit of guardrail is the fact that you have to go through a native Core SDK interaction, which means you have to go through the process of going through the application store review. But we'll see. I have further some interesting bits in Europe, for example, with Apple finally agreeing to allow alternative App Store distribution methods. But I guess I would imagine that might be a bit of a point of friction, but just generally speaking, ability to rely on no middlemen and call these like attestation clients and so interacting with it with your, for example, biometrics and the security is an interesting bit that I just wanted to touch base on a little bit as well, because obviously the fact that, for example, with HD wallets, you could, as you've outlined, can generate multiple secrets from a single source of basically key phrase, basically in this case, or a seed phrase, but then how exactly you back it up is still very important, right? Because you would obviously wouldn't want to end up in a situation where literally your entire digital identity and everything associated with it is on a 25-word mnemonic that you wrote on a piece of paper and a pigeon ate it or something like that. How would you, I guess, and before that, I would really love to just do a sort of a final recap on the LiquidAuth by just briefly explaining a typical user journey, right? Say a user, just so that it's easy for people to have a mental model on why it's actually so important to have it, and also what would be the experience and how exactly would this be improved. Say on the surface, it may not seem like there's a lot of difference, right? But with that knowledge that you've just outlined in the previous set of answers, I think this already gives a great backstage for it. So now let's imagine a scenario where there's a simple marketplace, decentralized application on Algorand. Say you're an Algorand user or a person who develops this particular marketplace. Currently, if you were to use something like Feher or something like DeFly, you would most probably go through like a self-hosted versions of the wallet. And I assume obviously there will be a lot more improvements towards them also seeing how LiquidAuth could be reused in this regard. But so say you just want to place something on a marketplace. You open up your device, let's pick Android, given that LiquidAuth is, you can pretty much right now go on the repo and we'll add additional information for the listeners out there on how you can try it out and also how you can contribute. But say you are about to perform a listing on some decentralized exchange or a decentralized marketplace of sorts. You open up your Android device. Currently with Feher, you would need to sign the transaction. Say you are using an obscure browser of sorts that also does have default security settings in place, or you're using Safari on iOS. In most cases, there's at least there's a certain probability that you will hit a bit of a friction simply because it relies on WalletConnect. WalletOne in this particular case. So you would need to jump to the application, perform the signature using the biometrics, but those biometrics aren't necessarily associated with the biometrics that you'd be using in things like passkeys. And so you went through that experience, then it redirects you back to the browser and you continue with the app. So now let's imagine the same flow with everything we already know about how LiquidAuth works. And could you walk us through the same exact workflow, but adding a little bit of crucial information about why it's better and why it's actually going to be a lot more efficient?
Absolutely. So really the user journey is pretty simple for connecting with LiquidAuth, where the DApp can present a QR code. And in this QR code, all it has in it is the origin of the service and a unique ID to identify the request. And we can think of this as kind of like a one-time password where you're not currently authenticated. You don't really have the device that holds your credentials. It lives over on your mobile device. So our request ID is our one-time password that should be treated just like a one-time password. And we present it in a QR code so that the user can decide who gets to scan that. And usually that's going to be your mobile phone. And when you scan with your mobile phone, your device looks at the origin and looks to see if it already has a passkey or not. And if it does, it uses the existing passkey. If it doesn't, generates a new one. And once it has the passkey, it adds one additional signature to that passkey, which is your payment key or whatever key you'd like to use for that connection. Those both are submitted to the service alongside with that one-time password, and then both clients are connected to the server and they're allowed to exchange information about where they are on the network. And so once these two peers exchange that information, you can actually disconnect completely from the server because you have a real-time peer-to-peer data channel between those two clients. And this is great. This is not only great for some of the ethical or the worries around government interventions, things like that. That's one good benefit to it. But the real benefit is all of this communication is now going over public infrastructure. It is not coming through your service. And they have many layers of fallbacks in case you can't negotiate. Let's say we're at a conference like at Decipher. That was one of those tests where we were going to see how well WebRTC handles different environments, and you can't get more restricted or have a bad demo more often than you can at a conference. And so it worked great. The fallback system works great. It's able to discover where the device is locally, and if it can't connect locally over your Wi-Fi network, it takes one step to the next step, which it says, can I get to you through the router? Will you let me hole punch here? If the router says I'm enterprise level firewall, I will not let you hole punch. There's a final fallback, which is called turn. And this acts just like a standard WalletConnect relay server. So we basically have a backup relay system that's just like WalletConnect if you're ever in an environment that requires that. And as we pursued some of this, we got really good feedback from people who have used it. And Ortho actually has provisioned some public turn servers over at Nodely, which from his experience, he said that they basically cost nothing to run because of the efficiency of modern turn servers, where this is, again, instead of taking WalletConnect and using their specific relay specification that they've designed, we're using a different relay system, which is standardized. It's used within WebRTC, and it also has a lot of really good features like privacy preservation and all the things you expect from a robust protocol or specification. And that is really where we see the reasons of building something like LiquidAuth versus going with a WalletConnect is that you don't get these types of features for free in a lot of context, or if you do get them, now you have to go upstream to request for them to add this to the specification, where something like Turn and WebRTC has really thought about a lot of these edge cases, and they've been around for about 10 years now and integrated in every major platform. In fact, we're streaming right now over a WebRTC connection. So to me, it's the obvious choice. And I think a lot of people have different opinions there, and that's healthy. And that's what we're saying is this is one option for a data channel between two peers. We think it not only solves a lot of the ethical dilemmas around who controls the pipelines, but it removes the service entirely from the provider. So in the context of someone like Para, who have to run a V1 relay, now Ortho can run turn servers, and we all can share that as a fallback without having to rely on any trust issues, because again, the specification outlines all of that, where it is beautiful when you integrate over innovate, where it's still innovation, but it's really letting these specifications shine, letting them do all the work, and us providing primitives to the community that they can build on. And as it is right now, it's FIDO, and WebRTC. And we really think these two things are going to be where a lot of systems go in the future. And I can speak a little bit to that with libpeer-to-peer, which is a library that's used by several blockchains, including Algorand, as kind of a peer-to-peer gossip layer or a communications specification. And the thing that they've also adopted this past year was a WebRTC transport. And so a lot of things are aligning. I could see within the next 5 years that libpeer-to-peer has really good Golang WebRTC support. So now things really open up, because now WebRTC is now machine to machine, and we have a stable protocol like libpeer-to-peer, which is just pure speculation because the future is uncertain. But without having these primitives, without having a functional working example of WebRTC, we really won't have anywhere to go, because we won't have any knowledge, and we'll be playing catch up like we always tend to do in situations. And so that's what we're doing, is we're coming out as a canary. So here's WebRTC, libpeer-to-peer. Several other industries are leveraging WebRTC, like Zoom, Google Meet, and we're just aligning and providing that integration work so that we can come together and decide as a community where this can go. Because it's really just two primitives, WebRTC and WebAuthn, and we're using them together in a clever way. And we think that there's more clever ways to use it. And obviously, there's a huge pain point right now with message passing and WalletConnect. So we decided that was a really good first feature to show what you can do with authentication. So the real mission of LiquidAuth is to demonstrate passkey authentication and managing public key credentials. But it's like, what can you do when you have them? Well, you can create a signaling server that connects two peers together. And that was the first big feature that we went with, but people can build many features on top of this. It's like the primitives are very simple, and we feel like it can evolve into many different things. Some of them I've outlined, some of them we won't even know until they come, but we really feel good about the primitives, and we hope the community does too.
What would you say is an average costs associated hosting some of those servers? For example, if you were to deal with, say, re-implementing or contributing something that expands on LiquidAuth. Say someone, after listening to this particular episode, gets excited and he goes ahead and contributes to LiquidAuth and wants to do something a bit more sort of self-hosted in this particular case. Because I do assume some of the components of that spec imply implementation when there's a server that you would have to host, right? Because you still need to communicate with the attestation devices, understand how to interact with them and things like that.
Absolutely. The FIDO specification very clearly has a use case for public key credentials, and that is submitting them to a REST service. And they even go as far as to outline what that REST service should look like, and you can bring it into conformance and have it certified by the FIDO Alliance that your service abides by the specification. And so that is really a fundamental requirement with passkeys. And we started there by providing this service. Now, obviously, you can break out of conformance and use abstracted accounts or things, but I think that getting that certification would put a little bit more difficulty on it than it is the traditional by the books way. And for us, it is very much something that's a work in progress for the documentation, but you can find at liquidauth.com a link to the documentation that will guide you through either running it locally or provisioning it as a Docker image. And once it's provisioned, you can use the demo Android app, or you can use the JavaScript client in order to start working with it. And realistically, there is only two real concepts when it comes to LiquidAuth. There is the server and the client. And you can think of it almost like two services, because the client really does share a lot of responsibilities. With WebRTC, it's doing most of the message passing. The service is very minimum. As we outlined in the user story, it just takes a credential and looks for a peer. And if it has a peer, it just lets them talk to each other. Both clients do all the talking. The server is just a gate that just says they can talk or they can't. And once they've established a connection, the server is irrelevant unless you have private information or maybe a dashboard or something like that. Like then obviously you would want to contact the server for that. But for all of our message passing, all of our transaction requests, they're all going over that data channel. And that is the main interesting part of LiquidAuth, of what you can do once you can prove someone is who they say they are, is you can give that person a little extra information and you can securely connect their devices using standards that handle largely the work effort. And we're just integrators at that point.
And just to recap as well, you've mentioned proof of knowledge. So if my understanding on that correctly, and that's something that you as a developer would probably see as one of the first sort of terms that appears in the documentation. I guess in this particular instance, it's essentially that hash that you get after the private key from the attestation device was used to sign something that is a public key in this particular case. So this would that particular hash be a fair sort of estimation for what is called or used as a term proof of knowledge within the LiquidAuth?
Yeah, I think this is a great opportunity to talk a little bit more about the longer term goals of LiquidAuth too, as I know right now we're very much focused on proof of knowledge of Algorand keys, but in the implementation, what we call the Liquid extension, it is a extension to FIDO that allows you to add the extra key, like I mentioned before. And this is what we're calling proof of knowledge, where you have your public key credential, which is your pass key, and now you need to add an additional proof of knowledge. And it's still early in its final design, but we have an interface that allows you to say, I have an Algorand public key specific to Algorand. And the reason that we've done that is because Algorand also has ecosystem specific things with their keys, like the rekey event. So I could technically post a encoded address that has been rekeyed to another address. So if I need to verify, I need to actually verify against another. So these types of things have been encapsulated in a strategy pattern where another ecosystem could come along and say, here's my Cardano extension interface for FIDO, and they could use the same system to communicate between two peers and things like that. And this is a long-term goal of the platform, to be agnostic, to only deal with primitives, and then allow the specifications to shine, and we get out of the way. So we don't want you to be hard-coded into X environment, must use these type of key pairs. It's very much designed to be extensible from the beginning. And one of the reasons we went with extending FIDO instead of doing a bespoke implementation.
And I guess since we started touching a bit on the future development, which is probably the most exciting topic, obviously it's a bit speculative, but I think there's a lot of indicators here that this is pretty much, and also taking an example of, this is something that in a Web2 space, a big enterprise would have to deal with on a regular basis, and big enterprises are dealing with adoption and interoperability on regular basis as well. I feel like this is a big lesson that is finally starting to propagate into this sort of space of Web3. So it's absolutely amazing to see that this wave of sort of maturity companies that, it's all about interoperability at the end of the day, and starting to collaborate on different protocols. So I'm very on board on this whole initiative of just trying to destigmatize blockchains a little bit, because if you think about just Algorand itself and the capabilities it provides, there has been inherently a lot of thinking within this financial sector. Obviously, they're great. The public ledgers, or as John Woods would say, decentralized operating systems on public ledgers in this case are not necessarily a great use case just for the financial systems. And yeah, I think just approaching this as a tool and looking from a perspective of what could be reused, and from the space of enterprises that has been dominating for a while on the internet, and looking into the future developments, right? What do you think are the next, and I know you touched on this a little bit, so feel free to skip a little bit on the things that you think you've covered already, but What would you say are the most crucial next steps for the development of LiquidAuth? And are there any upcoming sort of features or improvements that developers might see before end of this year? Um,
Absolutely. So right
Obviously,
now,
within the bounds of NDA, if there's anything that needs to have explicit approval.
don't worry, it's not real fresh alpha on this one. This is
Spicy alpha.
Yeah, this one is very much part of the ARC process, and we're going through and backfilling a lot of the things that are in progress. So, with LiquidAuth being a canary, we jumped ahead with things like arbitrary signing. We also jumped ahead with the provider interface. So now we're going through and really making these things concrete. We have Agora Labs has a really good example for a TypeScript implementation of ARC 27. So we went ahead and started adopting those models that are provided in the ARC in Kotlin so that we can use them in our native clients, because LiquidAuth stays out of the way, as I mentioned. So it just gives you a data channel. It doesn't care what comes across the wire. And the reason we did that is, again, back to that point, we don't want to lock this in to say this only supports Algorand messages, etc., things along those lines. So for us, it is the wires agnostic, and we have a provider that is allowed to consume these messages and handle them appropriately. Our first one is the AVM provider, which will be obviously for the AVM, but it'll be a basis for other integrators to go ahead and either implement maybe a custom para provider or things along those lines, like the Kotlin version of Use Wallet.
Hmm. And is there an SDK for Kotlin, or it's something that's piggybacked from the Java SDK? I believe there's still a Java client that's available on the Algorand's org on GitHub, right?
There is actually, and it is one of those situations where the library will work great, but since it's a provider interface, it really steps out of the way and allows the integrator to decide those decisions on what kind of cryptographic libraries they want to use. It's mainly just the interfaces. So when this event happens, what interface will get called for that strategy pattern so that we can replace any provider with any other provider. Everything works. Happy days.
Nice, nice. And so if you were to essentially having some closing sort of notes on the LiquidAuth, obviously approaching this as a canary, having a lot of more extra sort of eyes from the community and just having a little bit more collaboration in the space, seeing what sort of projects are being built into it. I'm pretty sure a lot of people will stand with the principles behind LiquidAuth and would be interested in trying it out. I'm sure there has been an uptake after the decipher already. Say I'm interested in basically just exploring what LiquidAuth is and seeing if there's ways to potentially help or contribute certain things into some of the existing repositories that were open sourced. If you were to start with the community contribution, what would you say are sort of the main resources available for people who would want to learn about it?
Absolutely.
All of those would also be included into the description of the episode as well. So if you're listening, or if you are at the part of listening this particular section, just feel free to jump to the description of the episode and you will see all the links that Mike has outlined during the episode.
It's very great that we have three separate contexts with LiquidAuth, and we have an Android context, we have a JavaScript context, and we have a server context. And with the JavaScript client and the Kotlin client, these are just two examples that are very minimal wrappers around FIDO and WebRTC. So if you want to get involved and you're into client work, those two libraries would be where I would start. And if you are more into service work or microservices or things along those lines, then we have a server library that provides a reference for the authentication service. And so, really, depending on what you're comfortable with, between the three of those, there is plenty to dive into with this big focus on our primitives, where you'll see a lot of the classes are actually separated between FIDO and WebRTC, and we really only provide a light wrapper around them. it's a really great opportunity to look at these interfaces, see what's available in WebRTC, see what you can do with passkeys, and really try to explore your options. At the very minimum, at a base case scenario, you can use it to authenticate to your service if you're adapt, and then connect to peers that may be one of your use cases that is already supported. But obviously, with introducing this to the community, people are going to think of new, clever ways to come up with that handle these primitives in new, interesting ways. And that's really what this is all about, is this collaboration, this feedback cycle is the only way we can really move forward. Is if we put out these primitives and we get no feedback, then there's not a lot that we can hold on to and get excited about, because it's a lot about being able to be excited about the things you're working on. And this one so far has gotten a lot of people excited. We think it's cool. And so I think if you find it interesting, please dive in wherever you feel comfortable. There is no requirements here. If you have a passion and you're interested, then go to liquidauth.com, get into the documentation, find what context you're into, whether it's the client or the server, and let us know if you find anything at all, even if it's a minor bug or even documentation could be better. All these things help us more than you can imagine. And it's more eyeballs are going to make a lot more shallow bugs where we'll have a robust system that really should be owned by the community. It's like we are building this for the community. So that is what I would love to see, is just us come together. We can talk about these primitives. We have a concrete canary that we can use today to integrate into our systems. And we're here to help in any possible way that we can. And if we find new innovative ways to handle passkeys, everything is on the table. And this is a open arms to the community and to the ecosystem in general, just to come in and talk about these types of things, because we're a bit further ahead than a lot of the ARC processes. So we have the ability to really get through that integration pain. And if we turn back and we find that here is exactly how we want to move forward with these things, we can codify that into an ARC, and we will match that ARC with LiquidAuth. And it really is, can't be done without everyone involved, because solutions providers need solutions integrators. And as we are right now, we feel like we have a solution. This is the ask for the integrators.
I wonder if there's any work being planned on some of the things like use wallet v3 in this case, because it's a fairly popular framework in the ecosystem. Lots of people use it. I could imagine if it's a smooth migration process, or if it's like a matter of adding a new wallet provider, in this particular case, adding a checkbox, just having the sort of the learning curve, or the entry point into something that allows you to quickly and easily test and experiment on LiquidAuth could be simplified a lot. And we obviously have this thing in the official AutoKit templates as well. So the React template comes bundled with Use Wallet, that we, by the way, should be and would be updating to v3 sometime soon as well. But that's the front where we could also easily have something like that available as soon as there are options. And maybe that's also something that, once again, Use Wallet is an open source project as well, maintained by the TXN Labs in this case. But yeah, are there any preferences on your side in regards to ways to pretty much reach out with issues or PRs? Obviously, there's a very vibrant Discord community. For the listeners out there, you can always reach out. There's a very clearly defined set of topics over the entirety of the Algorand ecosystem, and the ecosystem maintained by the Algorand Foundation. You can pretty much get answers on any topic you want. There's an amazing team of DevRel engineers who will assist you with the integration hurdles or just general programming questions you may have. But other than that, within the context of LiquidAuth, would it be something like, in my opinion, obviously, if you think this is a very clearly defined issue that you would want to report, I assume the closer it is to the source of truth or the source of the issue, the better that would be in your case.
Absolutely. Like Discord is a great resource. We have forums as well, and either one of these is great for entry level. If you're non-technical and just asking questions, you'll get a lot of great feedback. And for the more technical questions or things like that, always feel free to add issues or discussions to the repos. And that is the main avenues right now for LiquidAuth. And as we grow, I'm sure we're going to get more and more dedicated ways to handle ingress. But since we're so early in the life cycle of the application, it's like we really are focused on the core community, our core dApps, and bringing them in to really give it a shakedown, see what breaks, tell us where it hurts. And that's really our focus right now. Do not still come and make suggestions. But as it is right now, we're looking for integrators to adopt, and we're here to support them first and foremost. But obviously, as you mentioned, our resources are really great for DevRel, the forum support. It's like any kind of questions that you have. There's many wonderful people over there. Some of my favorite people are between those two spaces.
Awesome.
Yeah.
All right, then. So I think this has been a great overview in general of what LiquidAuth is. If you got excited and got interested in the some of the demos that were announced fairly recently and some of the earlier discussions that you may have seen on LiquidAuth being mentioned and things like Discord, I think you might find this episode very informative for how you essentially can get involved, how you can try it out. Maybe as a very final question before we dive into some of the more interesting, I would say, community-based initiatives happening within the AwesomeAlgo organization on GitHub. What about folks coming from like iOS background? Say there is someone who's a proficient iOS engineer, have found LiquidAuth very interesting. What is it, are there any particular bits where a useful work could be performed, while I assume there's still some blockers from this? There's a reason why iOS is not currently supported. So if you could just maybe briefly expand on that, if there's any way for, say, an iOS engineer to still be able to contribute or somehow potentially speed up that process, seeing LiquidAuth prototypes on iOS devices.
Absolutely. It's if you look at our signaling clients and our FIDO client, it is very light wrapper, very simple primitives. It's just simple REST calls and native API abstractions. So for most engineers, especially who have Swift and iOS capabilities, it would not take them much to dive in to the basics. It would take a little bit to get into the specification deeply, but really it's not that bad. It's like in the browser, it couldn't be easier to handle these options and get credentials. So if anyone out there is interested, any kind of prototype would greatly be appreciated because it is on our backlog. But at the same time, it's like why community involvement is great is that we're really looking for the primitives, testing the use case, and I would greatly appreciate a Swift client. I think
You mean
there's a lot of
like a native Swift client, or because there
there's
there are options to also just go ahead and grab something like an open API spec, right? And pre-generate just specifically the, say, the calls that you want to make against AlgoD, or in this case, I guess all you would need to worry about is primarily having some of those low-level crypto primitives being available to perform the signing.
it's 4 endpoints and a WebSocket service. So it's like there's 2 endpoints for registration, 2 endpoints for validating credentials, which is you get your challenge, you send back a signed challenge on both. And realistically, the primitives and using them is very shallow. Like you mentioned, you can use the Swagger reference on the documentation, or you can look at the signaling client or the FIDO clients in the client libraries, and either one of them will show you basically the gist. And as long as you're handling the options from the service and getting a passkey from your authenticator, it's really just that simple. It's really just going through the integration. And I think that if we don't get to it with relatively soon, that I would definitely suggest Swift developers to kind of dig into passkeys, what they look like, back to the primitives, start looking at WebRTC and WebAuthn, and all we've done is create a light wrapper around them to allow for things that aren't supported by the host.
I haven't been actively involved with the iOS stuff for like at least 5 years, but I'm pretty sure the WebAuthn and the passkeys bits are highly likely to be nicely abstracted by Apple in the core SDKs, and you just need to open up the framework, find the right way to import them, and you just have everything there for you handed over to parse and implement, basically. So yeah, I guess that really does sound like there's no excuse if you're an iOS dev interested. I'm pretty sure you'll be able to go through even with the existing implementation and use the Android bit as a reference. All right, which ideally would be, I could imagine the closest experience we have to this is like having Algorand on Apple Pay, right? If you can interact with the passkeys, and if there's a way to seamlessly invoke the signing bit without the redirect to a separate app that has the passkeys, that would have been really useful. Like the way you can, for example, use the passkeys for regular website authentication, there's a way to basically do that within the sort of browser experience or invoke through the browser experience so that it doesn't redirect you. I think that would have been extremely convenient. Just quick face biometrics approval or a scan with your fingerprint or even just a quick pin, but it's still being offline on your device. In this particular case is an attestation device. I think that would have been huge.
Yep. You got it. That's really the feature that Android 14 introduced, where the ability to allow that seamless integration. And outside of Android 14, the QR code does the exact same job. In fact, when you first registered your phone, you would have had to scan a QR code prior to using it as a device for passkeys. And so a lot of our QR code is inspired by the underlying FIDO implementation, which we call the hybrid transport. And so this is a hybrid. LiquidAuth is effectively a passkey hybrid transport outside of the scope of Google, basically.
I also really like that analogy you made in the beginning about thinking about passkeys as TypeScript while WebAuthn is JavaScript. But yeah, before we close, though, I think there's a few exciting announcement about some of the repositories that are being consolidated in their Awesome Algorand repository and the Awesome Algorand organization. So just to quickly recap, basically there was a set of things myself and Mike have been maintaining separately, and we think those are really useful, but obviously with the current commitments on the main work with AlgoKit, and in case of Mike, working some of the core things such as LiquidAuth, it's a lot harder to just have free time to allocate and still do fun things within the main commitments. And so what we thought of is, what if we just consolidate all the efforts under one open source organization pretty much, and that could also serve as a test bed, for example, things that may be expanding on functionality within AlgoKit for which we just simply don't have time to work on in the main commitments, but we can still have a modified fork, for example, to experiment, and then the people using that could essentially be the key factors to determine if it's actually useful, and then being used as a push to propagate to an official set of features. But really, it's not just that. Literally, it's also trying to see on a lot of the efforts with the repositories, and I'll obviously give a word to Mike because it's largely a lot of the tooling that he moved under the AwesomeAlgo Foundation, and a lot of the ideas behind it was also something that he reached out as a proposal, and I was more than excited because I remember that this was a peak of a few very intense things with AlgoKit v2 release, and yeah, I was just in the Python sort of world, really deep into that stuff, and really wanted to see how we can continue with the AwesomeAlgo podcasts and just still having this sort of informal format, bringing up engineers and just having exciting chats about things that everyone within this ecosystem is, I think, are deeply appreciative of, and essentially set of things that I would love you to just quickly cover is, so aside from the repo, right, still the same conventions. If you're an engineer, a developer in our ecosystem, you can come in. If you would want to highlight a project that is interesting, feel free to submit a an issue. The awesome thing is actually a fairly popular convention that we are simply following. It's just a way to organize README files. There's nothing special about it. But aside from that particular main repository, obviously, you have an opportunity to chat about this technology. If you would want to do a little deep dive with myself and Mike to go over the things that you're building on Algorand, there are ways for you to submit a proposal to appear on this podcast on the awesomealgo.com website, which we highlight at the end of every episode. And additionally, now it's not just an ecosystem of scattered repositories under a public username. You can all find them all conveniently consolidated if you just go to github.com/awesomealgorand. And a few very exciting things that are coming from Mike's side in this case is some new web specific packages, I would say in this case, that would really simplify ability for you to interact with primitives and abstractions and typed abstractions on Algorand. And I would love you to just quickly highlight some of those things, because I think it would be also awesome to see people potentially using that and trying it out as well. Because if you use it and if you try it out and if you continue doing so, once again, you become one of the key metrics for us to then also say, well, people in the community are using it. Why not try to formalize this and actually maybe move it a bit further in the hierarchy and see if we can turn this into an official set of features that could move under Algorand Foundation org.
Absolutely. You couldn't have said it better. I think we've been trying to get this going for almost a year now, and it is one of those early things of between MakerX and ourselves and people like the Feher team. Like, we have plenty of work to do, and we are not looking for real extra work, kind of like these things. And so all of these what ifs either never make it out of somebody's company or anything like that. And so really AwesomeAlgo I saw as a thing I see a lot in our community, where there's just individuals who are dedicated and they love our ecosystem and they want to pursue the what ifs. They want to make other engineers' lives easier. Like, you can think of TXN Labs and Use Wallet with Doug. It's just, this is probably a unique feature in crypto almost, where obviously we have our speculators and a lot of people that are in it for the wrong reasons, I would say. It's my opinion. But then you have these people that are like there through markets like we're in right now, and they're building because they genuinely care about the chain and the ecosystem. And it can get spicy, but it's like people who are not doing that kind of stuff have checked out. So it's like the people who are being vocal, in not in all cases, in a lot of cases, they're good faith. Those are the people that have inspired me throughout my whole journey with Algorand, and the reason I'm here today. And it's one of the things I wanted to join up with you, because you're one of those people in the ecosystem, to just say, hey, here's a place for us all to go to explore these what ifs, and we have support. It's you're not alone. You're not going to be hacking through these things every night and then get stressed out, burnt out, all these things. It's, we want a place that we can hang out and not distract our backlogs. Like, TXN Labs got plenty of work, I'm sure. Like MakerX, Algo Foundation, we're all busy. So it's a place for us to come together, talk about these ideas, explore the options of what you can do with AlgoKit, with LiquidAuth and its primitives and things like that. And if we come up with something nice, like our first big project is starting to digest smaller parts of our ecosystem, where I've been a big advocate of meta-based programming or just like code generation in general. And I think AlgoKit has some really great tools in that avenue. So we started to look at things like, well, how can we make everyone's life easier without really changing anything fundamentally? Because we don't want to bring in something brand new and say everyone has to move to this. So what I've basically done is I take the Open API specifications, and they are maintained by the Inc., and they are provided in each tagged version release of the API. When this new tag comes out, I look in my package file for my current version, and if it's different, I regenerate the package from the specification. And I try, as well as the Inc. has done a really good job and making sure that their operations are as close to the specification as possible. So there's really almost a one-to-one from the API that has been generated to the existing Algorand client that everyone uses from the JavaScript package. And so this is our first what ifs. It's, well, what if we automated the RPC client? And I think that alone is kind of a good first start and the ethos of kind of where I want to explore with AwesomeAlgo and the community of we can present something like the Algo Fetch client to projects like the Inc. or AlgoKit or any organization that just wants to have maybe account information and they don't need the entire SDK with its primitives and its encoding libraries and anything like that. So if we start to wrap these closures around each one of these things, with right now, we're thinking RPC for fetch, models like we're used to with the factories and the SDK, make payment transaction with suggested params.
Yeah.
And then crypto, so all the cryptographic primitives and encoding primitives. And it's really between those three that we can really start to look at something like SDKs. If Algo SDK was composed of components like this, then there would be no conflict between Algo SDK and AlgoKit because they would both share the same primitives. So the opinions of either one would not ever affect each other and they would all share the same type system. And so this is one of those what ifs. It's like one of those, we don't really have time to explore these kind of fundamental deep-seated changes. And we really need the community to be behind it anyway, because they're the ones at the end of the day that have to run npm install. So that is what we're presenting. It is, here is an opportunity to basically come up with deep-seated problems, try to solve deep-seated problems in a way that's outside of the scope of any organization, no strings attached. There is pure free and open source software for the benefit of the ecosystem and nothing else. That is the main goal. I think having a place where we can all come together in an informal way is like some of my favorite hack spaces have been that way.
Would love to also discuss a bit further later on to see if maybe we could also prep a few categorized issues on some of those repositories to just simplify the process of picking out where a person can contribute, so that if someone comes in, it's not immediately putting an assumption on you that you have to go through a steep learning curve essentially to be able to help. But obviously, if you're familiar with Algorand ecosystem, if you've interacted with JavaScript, Python SDK, or if you're building an AlgoKit, I think even that audience might benefit from a little bit more guidance on the contribution. And all of that is something that we will be obviously continuously improving on the Awesome Algorand organization, and maybe even the process to see how folks can join as contributors to the work, because that's also something that would be great to see, basically seeing a little community expanding and experimenting on things that then potentially prove or disprove whether it's useful, and then we see if this can become an official tooling. Or but yeah, and what you've just described, for the listeners out there, what's the best way to currently interact with that? And it's available on the Awesome Algorand organization, but that's the repository under the name, I assume, Algo Fetch in this case.
Algo Fetch is the primitive library. And if you want to see a reactive example that is a wrapper around the fetch library, it is use Algorand. And so that is just taking the generated fetch client and wrapping it in TanStack query, which has been a great tool. And I cannot say enough how much that I can appreciate the generators that we're using. We're using a project called Hey API, and they took over the Open API TypeScript generator, and they provide a really elegant typed client that has an abort controller, as well as just like really elegant typings. Like I can't say enough how much I appreciate the architecture decisions they went with for the client generation. And it's even abstract, very much like the Algo SDK, where you can implement your own client if you don't like the default one and put in whatever you want. And they also have a concept called interceptors, where you can actually put middleware on your requests. So it's just like all these things are so nice to have, and even better that it's code gen, that we just don't even think about it and let it be automated. So I just want to say that if it weren't for open source projects like Use Wallet, like Hey API, Tanstack Query, like we would be in the Stone Ages. And that's another thing that I hope to bring in with Awesome Algorand, is this whole concept of the list is really important, but then also showcasing some of the list and offering some of that expertise that Awesome Algorand would have with the rest of the community. So this is showing ways of integrating use wallets with AlgoKit, and also doing things like pulling in metadata from different smart contracts, and just really being a place where we can workshop ideas and tools. I think When Tools is another great example where they have a whole utility module inside of the project. That would be something wonderful to bring into the Awesome Algorand ecosystem, package it up, get it out to the public so people can mint their own NFTs in bulk or any of the same features that When Tools has. And it's really building these bridges. If there's any kind of blockers or just capacity issues, it's like, what if is Awesome Algorand? What if we had a package for When Tools? Then it's, you don't have to go to the website. You can build your own smart contract and your own app and have similar feature sets. And those are the things that excite me, at least. I hope they excite more than just me, but it is.
No, absolutely, absolutely. Yeah, I would also love to spend some extra time to make the main repository a bit more automated. There's already a lot of things around it, like the convention that I used to use as initiatives to basically where you can put a tag or any repository that is whitelisted in the Algorand ecosystem, and it shows up on this board that a open source contributor can use as a map to see, okay, what's an issue that a maintainer of that thing within Algorand considers as a good entry point or a medium level, and I assume that's actually something that the DevRel team is going to think on how this could be done natively as part of the Algorand Foundation work. But that's still available under the Ask Awesome Algorand. We still have the code for some of the AI search, for example, of the quick schema of the resources, because it's still very much in line with the idea that you can use this as a tiny little subset to quickly pick a good tool within the ecosystem, not necessarily something that falls under the official tooling. Although obviously we also recommend the official tooling a lot as well. The fragmentation is not the greatest thing that can happen when there's just too many bicycles in the ecosystem, and it's great to see that this consolidation efforts were happening on many different layers, and but driven by many different organizations within the ecosystem of the past couple of years.
Yeah, it's been great. Like Use Wallet has been one of like my favorite things to watch grow, where a lot of that started way early on. And just to see where it is now gives me a lot of hope for the ecosystem, because it proves that like it is possible to do things outside of the scope of the bottom line, where it's like that doesn't deliver, it may deliver some business value for TXN Labs, but that's a work of a labor of love. And that is where I think we have a good opportunity to just hang out with everyone, say, we're here. I'm dedicating the next infinity to just hammer down on anything we can think of. And I obviously have a 9 to 5, but outside of the scope of that, it's, for me, I'm constantly searching. And with my disability, this is something that's very normal for me. I don't recommend it for many people, but for me, this is where I'm happiest. And I think that by leveraging the talent that we have in the community, seeing what has come out with the abstractions in V3 Use Wallet, this is the place I want to be. It's the place that I've hoped for the longest time, seeing reflective models inside modern frameworks with the proper abstractions. This is something that must be done by the community. There's no organization that is going to be able to come up with a solution like that without engaging with the community. And that's really where I'm at as well, with a lot of the things like LiquidAuth, as well as the AlgoFetch library and things that are offered at Awesome Algorand in general, where just basically, hey, we're all in this together. here's a safe place for developers that like express your ideas, tell us what you think, tell us where it hurts, because we don't grow without healthy criticisms and things of that nature. And that's really from LiquidAuth to Awesome Algorand is my mentality. And please feel free to contact any of the resources. You'll find me on Twitter as Feher0 most commonly, and that's the quickest way to get to me. But
nice, and I'll make sure to have the profile on Twitter included in the. But you can also find us and reach out to people on the by directly opening the issues on any of the repositories within the Awesome Algorand org. And I guess as a final set of closing questions, are there any particular? I know I've been asking for people who might be aspiring engineers specifically in the Web3 space, but I really think that with the recent announcements and the innovations in the tech space, and not necessarily innovations in cases like LiquidAuth, as you're highlighting, sometimes it's not all about innovation. Sometimes it's just catching up with what the majority of the internet is pushing. And when we say majority of internet, currently it unfortunately implies big enterprises hold majority of the power over internet. But what advice would you give to people who just, obviously, if you have a problem to solve, you have to approach it from a perspective whether particular technology is the right solution. But say for people who identify that blockchain is the right solution for their particular edge case, and they are also early in their software engineering career, are there any particular advices that you would give for people who would want to expand their engineering skill set, but within the blockchain space in general?
absolutely. I think that a lot of the resources that we have at the foundation have been monumental in getting people on board, and some of the outreach is directly targeted to Web2 developers. So even if you don't feel like you're ready for all the crypto stuff and all these very obscure terminologies that you may have never heard before, you can rest easy knowing that a lot of the content that's coming out is focused on Web2 from the foundation's perspective. And it's really one of those things that highlights some of the work of MakerX and your team, is just what that does is this very same mindset that we have with public key credentials. It's like when you adopt the specification to a T, it unlocks all of the tooling and all the features that ecosystem comes with. And then you're talking about things that people understand. And you don't need to necessarily document the Python language. You can point to the actual Python documentation. And that's really one of the benefits of adopting standards and just integrate over innovate. Even though it's innovative, it is some of the most innovative work I've seen in a long time. But at the same time, it's this mentality of someone's already solved this problem. We're just going to leverage the same tech. And I think when you're thinking of technology and trying to enter into a field, it's almost a universal thing that the only thing that you're doing at work is running into a problem, getting the confidence to solve it, feeling great, and then running into another problem. And it's this loop is the engineering loop. And you'll see it reflected in practices like extreme programming, where if you're not focused on the V2 while you're writing the V1, and if that doesn't excite you, then it's very difficult to swim in that environment. So my advice is always to find the place that you like to swim in, where if you're able to run into a problem and not get discouraged, and it gets you excited that like you solve it and you feel that rush of accomplishment, and then all of a sudden you're hit with another issue. If that's the kind of thing that excites you, even if it's not, it could be something like a gardening, where you have a crop failure, and if you're back at it the next season, then that's really what I think is important. That's the things that I value in general, is that finding people who are passionate about what they do. And then on top of that, perseverance, especially in technology. It's not easy. It is always going to have challenges, and it's never ending. There's never going to be a situation where you say, okay, I'm done. I figured out all there is to know. I've mastered computers. It's just, there's no such thing. And I really feel that's okay. And that these problems aren't easy. A lot of similar circumstances are not necessarily easy problems, but if you're able to stay engaged, if you find the content interesting, then foster that enjoyment. And even if it doesn't go anywhere, it doesn't need to have large aspirations. You don't need to be the next Bill Gates or anything like that. It really is like mental health is the most important thing in our field. It is where I see the most complications. So it's find what you love, be comfortable with what you love, and really just take care of yourself. Because if you're able to get in even at an entry level, so if you're able to find a internship or anything like that, just go at your own pace, take the challenges as they come. And if you find yourself saying, yeah, wow, that was crazy, I just learned about threading in Python, like because you hit some single threaded limit and you needed to scale. These things are exciting. They're fundamentally problems. Everyone's going to hit them, and there's going to be new problems in the future. And so I find it to be like, I obviously am biased. This is the most fun that I can have. But at the same time, I want people to have realistic expectation of it is what you make out of it. You can go as far as you want. There's no silver bullets, but at the same time, that is the job. It is like waking up every day and knowing that the world could be burning, but that's great because now we have some fundamental assumption that has changed, and that's important because that's new information. Failing fast and things like that. These are the things, like that feedback is how we grow as individuals, as engineers, and things like that. That's where my advice is always, regardless if it's technology or not, it is just find the thing that you can be Sisyphus, and don't worry about getting to the top. It is being okay with pushing the rock.
And I think just looking at the Algorand ecosystem over the years is a good example. Like the engineers who I guess have the most interesting, engaging work these days is the ones who pretty much just always found ways to reignite the passion in some sense in the work that they're doing. And obviously it's being excited about something is great, it's amazing, but as you're saying, being able to sustain that over prolonged periods of time, regardless of the environments and the conditions, if you truly think that this is something that excites you and this is interesting, and you're an aspiring engineer, so like you're just getting into this industry, I think you might find a lot more interesting challenges. But as long as you have some ways to reignite this passion, you can go a long way. So thank you for the beautiful statement there, Michael. I couldn't agree more with you. And maybe one closing note to the initial statement you made there is, I believe it's been only a couple of conferences where Algorand Foundation were attending to showcase some of the things with the Algo kit and the ability to essentially develop on Algorand. And if my understanding is correct, and I was actually assisting some of the DevRels during the We Are Developers conference in Berlin, and there was a lot of attendance, actually, a lot of two engineers and people talking about blockchains in general and considering this. And which makes me wonder that at the end of the day, it does really seem like the adoption with, or like ability to get into the Web2 space, obviously with the compiler and these statements like it's a subset of Python, the cognitive load is significantly lower in this case. And I feel like this is an extremely important aspect, because you can imagine a scenario where, you know, like a team of senior Google engineers or senior engineers somewhere at Apple having a hackathon internally and in most cases, it's going to be something that they would still have biases around if it's a particular tool that they need to spend. So there are certain assumptions that could be made in general about people working in big tech. And I do feel like getting their attention is actually the matter of getting as much of the terminology stripped away from the technology. So if they see terms that they would often see in the cloud ecosystems or tooling, it's a lot easier for them to just mentally build something. Oh, so it's like a massive distributed Postgres database. I can just store stuff there and I don't actually need to even host it. It's hosted on a public ledger and my users are paying for using it. So, and I get a percentage directly. Wow. Like, and when you start building it in these terms, it's a lot easier to get them engaged in some sense. So I'm more than excited to see like where this particular approach is going to take. And if all goes well, at the end of the day, blockchain hopefully will be just perceived as the tool, same way as you need a reliable, I don't know, like a reliable blob storage. You'd probably go with something like S3 on AWS, right? Like a lot of people may hate things like that, but then it's a battle-tested technology that has been there for, decades. And once this will come down to ways of thinking about blockchains, I hope that Algorand is going to be one of the extremely battle-tested scenarios where you just go there not simply because it has a lot of base fundamentals that make it a very scalable solution, but also because it has a lot of maturity by integrating with a lot of specs and protocols that pretty much are adopted everywhere. And I think with that, I'd love to say a huge thank you to you, first of all, for proposals and us just finding time and getting around to consolidate some of the things we have under AwesomeAlgo. And I'm looking forward to the new set of episodes and potentially having you as a co-host on, especially in cases when there would be people who are very biased towards JavaScript, or maybe even hosting something like debates, having prominent builders in the ecosystem defending an arc versus a person attacking an arc. Or because I do believe if you look into some of those arc discussions, for example, obviously agreeing on a spec is an extremely hard challenge in general. Look at anything like up to some of the RFCs, an example in the Linux kernel, and the amount of heated discussions there, it can just blow your mind. If you think ARC discussions can get lengthy, that's just tip of the iceberg. But I do wonder if some of those preliminary things could be actually simplified or maybe even made faster by just having the main parties involved in the review of this ARC or the proposal of the ARC just come together. And I know there are ARC meetings basically that are being conducted, but I do wonder if there are also opportunities for platforms like this podcast where you don't necessarily are within a formal sort of weekly, bi-weekly community meetup where you have to just throw your opinion and then continue on that, but more of an informal where you get to explain your biases, get to explain why you think this is the right way to go. And maybe that's potentially can speed up some decision making behind the processes, basically. Because otherwise, what do you have? You have a comment that the person will leave. He may spend a lot of time thinking about the answer. He provides the answer, and then the ball goes to the next person. And it's literally like the conditions for a fully like asynchronous network, right? You can submit your comment, but you have no guarantee that there will be an answer or the answer will come soon.
It is very hard to get the real meanings of what they're trying to discuss out within a 30-40 minute meeting, and there's many stakeholders all involved at the same time, where it is like the informalness, I feel, is something that is important, to where workshopping on something like the podcast and all those things just seems like good vibes to me, where there's not a lot of, there should be a place for people to kind of vent.
Yeah,
when,
exactly.
like, it'll
And
be fun.
I think the good thing about ARCs in general is if there is a way to maybe speed up this process informally somehow, I feel like as long as there's a way for a person to just deeply explain his bias, this doesn't necessarily should mean that the intent is different, right? Because most of the ARCs is intents for people in the community to do something in the interoperability space or basically standardize some sort of building primitives that beneficial for everyone. So the intent is usually aligned. I hope in most cases. Obviously, there may be ARCs that not necessarily bring intents that, like for example, ARC 69, right? I have nothing against ARC 69, but it was largely rehashed from, I believe, some of the protocols or ARCs in the Ethereum ecosystem. And then just interacting with this was a little bit awkward, I would say. But then again, as long as the intent is aligned, if there's a way to quickly distinguish whether the person proposing an ARC has a good intent or not, then the discussion can reach consensus a bit quicker potentially.
Absolutely. And with things like the Awesome Algorand, where it's like there's possibility of coming up with prototypes and things, where that's where my mindset was. It's like getting a lot of the NFT arcs codified as packages, where a lot of times the arc system stops at reference and then kicks it off to the community, where that's perfectly fine. And like, we would never be a replacement for standardization efforts. But it's like having this kind of jujitsu area of saying, okay, like here's the arc that's in progress. I need to whip up a prototype that's way outside of the scope of just the reference that lives in the arc, just to prove it, just to say, hey, look, this is what it looks like. And a lot of these people are doing that with products, whether it's
No.
Akita or NFT, where it's like a very similar ethos, but more so for things that can get spicy or things that need a little bit more hashing in an informal way. Because I've been so happy with the formal process that's been introduced through the ARCs and the ATC. And it's those will always be fundamentally the standardizations path. But there is this whole what if path that we don't want to bother them with, really. It's we can't spend a whole ARC session of, well, what happens if we try this?
Yeah. But yeah, I guess on that note, I feel like there might be an interesting way to spring up a whole episode on ARCs, maybe do a little like a quick recap of the history of the ARCs, because some newbies, especially, it can be sometimes very, confusing to associate a whole bunch of protocol changes or features with a number. and there's a lot of numbers out there, the ARCs. But regardless, Mike, once again, thank you very much for coming. I'm more than excited to have you here and just talk about LiquidAuth. It's been a while since I did the previous episode, and as I said, the regularity of those are going to be a bit more chaotic, but I can ensure that the number of guests and the quality of the episodes going forward are going to get more technical in the discussions and are just going to highlight things that I think are generally useful for the ecosystem and as a whole.
Couldn't agree more.
And with that, as you finish this podcast, you will find some very interesting links in the Twitter announcement of this episode, where we are going to highlight an additional project done by Mike called NFT Bitmap. You will find all information in there, but essentially, we would like to hear your ideas about how do you think is the best way to potentially have some interesting community engagements around this, or some interesting giveaways that can be done with it. And if you're familiar with things like Reddit post challenge, you had a massive canvas basically of pixels and everyone competed on them. What Mike's NFT bitmap is showcasing is quite fascinating, actually. All of that is happening on chain with ability to basically respond reactively to the changes in the state on chain. So everything you will see on that project link is actually stored in an Algorand contract and lives on chain in a massive set of global states.
The most you can fit in the global state.
But yeah, with that, thank you for listening to this episode.
Till next time.